I've had a draft of this story set up for a while, but I've been too worried and scared to tell it. It made me question everything. My faith, my eyes, and my sanity. I've decided it's finally time to let others know what I've experienced. I recently moved westwards to Arizona from the boring state of Oklahoma. I'm a devout Christian, and never once before this had I believed there were entities in existence that we couldn't hunt down with our modern advancements. It is 2019, for heaven's sake. You would figure if we wanted to find something, we would and definitely could. This was the 23rd of December, 2018. I was in Payson, Arizona. It's a bit north of Phoenix. My friends and I, in our Christmas spirit, decided to head out north of town, about 5 or 6 miles or so into the forest on a secluded trail. It was cold that night. Some of my friends shivered and displayed obvious signs of unpreparedness. I was layered fairly well, and yet the wind was frigid cold and punctured through my layers and onto me. So, we wanted to make a bonfire, warm up, enjoy ourselves, and have a few drinks. I knew as soon as I got into the car to head that way, something was off. I felt sick, uneasy, and something in my gut told me to just stay home. But I couldn't put my finger on just what. And I ignored my ever so looming feelings of anxiety. We picked up our friends and headed to the trail. I'm a huge nature lover and have always felt safe in the confines of the forest. I felt in control, at ease, but not tonight. It may sound cliche, but I'll be damned if it didn't feel like someone or something was watching me when we finally got there. And when I had gotten far enough down the trail that turning back would have been no hasty endeavor, it finally hit me why I felt so creeped out. That same year, during the weeks prior to Thanksgiving, I had been here. It's not a spot we usually go to. Therefore, I was not too familiar with it, nor were any of my friends. We were coming out for the same reason we were in December, for a few drinks around a bonfire. It was late. I, however, hadn't had any spirits that night. It was my job to gather firewood. I didn't mind. My chance to survey and explore the area around us wouldn't be bad. Before I even left the area, things took a turn for the strange. I was at the edge of where the light being cast from the small bonfire ended. The one I was about to gather more fuel for. In the faint glow of the far trees, I caught a glimpse of something dart behind a tall pine. I asked back to my friends if it was out of the ordinary for people to be hanging around this spot. My question was only met with silence from them, and then they just continued to drink. I took a few more steps beyond the comfort of the blaze, keeping my eyes affixed on the tall, shadowy figure behind the tall trees. I could faintly make out that it had moved into a slight, bobbing motion, kind of like a buoy on a tide. My immediate thought drew a blank as to why someone would be out here doing this. Maybe I was just seeing things, or it was a prank of some sort. I opened my mouth to call out or even crack a joke, but was mortified when I realized I could not speak. It was like something inside of me prevented me from making any noise. My heart began to race. As swiftly as it came, it shot off into the distance like a bullet. Being startled so badly, I fell back onto the ground and kicked myself back like a spooked animal, scratching and cutting my hands as I do so. My friends saw me and laughed, thinking I was drunk. I managed to stammer out a line to what I saw, but was only met with a few blank stares and laughs, making me sound more stupid than I already looked. For the rest of the night, I didn't dare step away from the beams of the bonfire. As I walked down the trail that frigid December evening, I remember what I had seen and felt on that cold November night, and my stomach started to drop. My friends were slurring out Christmas carols and all their drunken epiphanies. I knew they wouldn't listen to me even if I spoke out about it, so I ignored the feeling, prayed for the best, and walked on. I hadn't been drinking much this night either. I don't really enjoy alcohol as much as my friends do, and I'm often the one responsible for hurting them home when the night was over. However, to calm my tense nerves, I did have a drink or two from a Jaeger bottle we had chilled in the ice chest. It was Christmas after all. We were all having a good time, enjoying our festive feelings and generally savoring the crisp forest atmosphere. Soon, nature called, and forgetting about my prior ordeal, I began to walk away from the fire to relieve myself. I walked a fair 300 or so feet away towards a big rock, resting behind some fallen trees. I didn't want to be seen doing my business. I was not even far enough away for the fire to not be able to hear my friends' voices echoing through the woodlands. From behind me, my friend Corbin, who had come along, called out my name. I'll admit I was a little tipsy, but nowhere near enough to not be able to tell reality from a drunken stupor. I remember calling out to him, telling him to give me a moment to finish. I zipped up and turned to walk around the rock to where I had heard him wander to. I don't know what it was, but as sure as all heavens above and hills below, it was not Corbin. It took me a minute for my mind to put this together and stop walking towards it, and I'm thankful I did. This being stood at least 6 or 7 feet tall. Its eyes burned like our fire. It moved from a dog-like 4-limb position to standing tall and upright. The light from the moon on this cold night radiated the body, showing off its dark, slender shape and inhuman sheen. I actually began to cry violently. My mind ran in panicked circles. Seconds felt like lifetimes as my world ground to a halt at the clawed feet of this beast that I was sure was going to take my life from me right then and there. I did the only thing I could think to do. I dropped to my knees and began to pray. This monster I was seeing, to my petrified brain, could have very well been the devil himself. Being able to imagine anything worse would have been impossible. It did not like my pleas to God, apparently. An unholy shriek of what I can only think to describe as someone screaming loudly with lungs full of water rang out. I screamed in terror and with all the strength I could muster, lunged backwards across the forest floor, running as fast as my legs could take me. I fell a few times. I could just manage to get my body to work properly, knowing that this thing was near. When I returned, in a panicked craze to the fire covered in sweat, dirt, and tears, I managed to wheeze out what happened somewhat through my sobs of fear. I could tell they doubted whether or not what I was stammering out was real or not. I think I was so horrified in that moment that I had a small seizure because everything became a blur. I remember going to the truck, leaving. I remember waking up the next day and receiving a multitude of texts, saying I was either stupid or crazy, or ones from worried friends asking if I was okay. I also remembered the last thing I saw of the thing before I made my frenzy to flee, when it smiled back at me through the forest and skittered off into the darkness. A few days after Christmas, I was able to get in touch with the native elder man here in town. I was so scared mentioning the event because I was worried of being mocked or him not believing me. To a twist of my thinking, I told him very vividly what I had encountered, and he wholeheartedly believed me and told me that it was a skinwalker. He then blessed me and told me to leave that stretch of land alone and to never venture out there again. Next time, I might not be so lucky. He didn't have to tell me twice about that one. I know I sound crazy. And if I were you, I probably wouldn't believe me either, and you don't have to. All you have to know is, for the love of God above and all things holy, never forget that we are not alone on this earth. Sometimes, during the night, to this day, whenever I look out my window, I still catch sight of eyes in the trees, looking back at me. This happened around 2 years ago. Me and a friend of mine were camping in a spot he called The Rock. It was just a massive boulder overlooking a river. The first night it was all okay until around 10:30. Me and my friend were just chilling, talking about experiences we had in life and stuff when he gets up to go take a piss. He walks a few meters away to a nearby tree line, and I decided to finish unpacking the sleeping bags. This took about 2 minutes, but my friend was dead silent, so I took a look in the direction he walked in and he wasn't there. So I got up, grabbed a headlamp and a heavy-duty flashlight and walked over to the tree line. He wasn't there either. I started to worry. Then I heard a voice from behind me say, "Hey, what are you looking for?" I spun around to see my friend in the tent, and I figured he walked around the side while I had walked over to his original spot. I walked back to the tent and got in, and suddenly it was extremely cold, and this was in the middle of summer. And when I say cold, I'm talking freezing. I turned to look at my friend after zipping up the tent, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw his eyes. They were so empty. No expression, no color, just cold. He was just staring at me when I noticed a little bit of blood on his shirt and a small hole on his chest, about the area his heart would be. I froze immediately. I had heard stories about people who get possessed or killed by skinwalkers. Fear is all I felt. True and utter fear. My blood went cold and I felt my heart stop. I reached behind me and unzipped the tent. I ran and sprinted as fast as I could. My heart started to sink when I heard footsteps directly behind me, and I could tell he was chasing and reaching out for me, trying desperately to grab my hoodie. Then, silence behind me. No slowing of footsteps, they just stopped. I got into my car and drove as fast as I could out of there. I called the police as soon as I got to a gas station, and they went out to check the place. But they found absolutely nothing, except for a single sliver of clothes on the ground, around where the footsteps disappeared. I never did see my friend again, and I moved out of that town a few months later. My name is Harry, and I live on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I've recently had an encounter with a creature that I can only label as a skinwalker. When I first encountered this beast, I did extensive research, and behold, everything the website described matched this creature perfectly. Now that that's out of the way, I have a story to tell. It was a chilly Monday morning. Cold water dripped from the icicles stuck to the gutter, and I had just packed my bags, ready for a morning hike. I was going to be out walking with my brother, but sadly, he had woken up sick, so I was alone on this journey. I really didn't care that much, but just for safety, I did decide to pack his handgun. After a little while, I was ready and said goodbye to my family. I intended to be gone for a good chunk of the morning, so I also packed a little bit of food. I step outside, and it was a lot colder than I expected. I didn't care though, because I had been planning this trip for weeks, and no matter what got thrown at me, I was still going. I walked for a while, and by this time most people would say they had a cliche feeling of being watched, but I didn't. It just felt like a normal hiking trip. There were a few occasions maybe where I checked over my shoulder or took a double glance at the tree line, but if you knew me, you would also know how much of a paranoid person I am anyways. Eventually, I set up a little camp, so I could just sit down for a second and take in the beauty of the surrounding area. This was when I first noticed something was wrong. The forest was silent, and not like no wind is silent. It was the kind of silent that was so quiet it was deafening. I felt quite unnerved. I instantly knew what this meant, and I took it as a message to keep moving and started walking again. First, it was that sound or lack of sound, and now I started to see things. It started as just a flash of fur in the far distance, but then it started getting closer. I figured out it was a deer, but that was about it. It then started to slow down, so I was able to identify some specific details. I saw the antlers first, and they were huge. I could tell the buck must have been an alpha, but then I looked at its face. It looked like a buck, but something was off about it. I can't exactly pinpoint what, but I think it was its eyes that stood out to me the most. They looked just like a human's, and its teeth. It had serrated teeth, and they kind of looked like a shark's. I continued to watch it until I was pushed back into reality by the realization that this thing was standing there, about 5 foot away from me, with a grin that spread across its entire face. I ran like hell and ditched the bag. The bag had the handgun in it, but I didn't care at the moment. I didn't even know where I was going. I was just running in one direction, and I didn't even look back to see if it had given chase. I just ran until I tripped over a stick and hit my head really hard. When I woke up, it was pitch dark. I was in the middle of nowhere with a broken ankle and nothing to protect myself. I was pretty sure I was gonna die. I tried my best to get up, and surprisingly, I could walk fairly well. Luckily, I have a high tolerance to pain. I started limping in a random direction, and eventually I reconnected to the trail and found the rest of my stuff. As I was walking, I started to doubt myself a little bit. Maybe it was just a dream or a hallucination. Maybe I just saw a normal buck. But my thoughts on this were suddenly confirmed when I heard a near-piercing scream. I looked to my right, and there it was, perched on a rock, head in the sky, howling like some kind of evil wolf. I knew it was testing me, seeing how long it would take to break me. But this time, I had the gun in my hand, and I didn't forget about it. I unloaded my entire clip into that thing. You should have seen the look on its face. It screamed like the spawn of Satan and ran into the woods. I carried on walking, and just a measly quarter of a mile away, I encountered 2 police officers asking me what the hell just went down. I told them I had encountered a pack of wolves. I could tell that they knew I was lying, but I could also tell that they didn't want to know what actually happened. I returned home and haven't seen that thing since. I know they're smart, and I know it's planning something, but I'll just have to wait and see what happens. I'm sure most of you have heard about the creature called the SKINWALKER. It's a slender, long-armed, long-legged human-looking thing that walks around in the dark. They usually have big, beady, glowing white eyes and are very, very misfigured. There are multiple stories across the internet that speculate about this creature. I'm here to tell you my experience with what I believe was a skinwalker. It was a nice day. I was coming back from my school on my bike and a thought popped into my head. My friend told me about these dirt tracks far deep into the woods. I decided to venture back there and see if I could find them and give them a ride with my new bike. It was pretty late that night because I stayed back because of some work I had to get done, so the sun was going down for the night. Anyways, as I was riding through the woods, I start to hear a distressed call coming from deep inside. I thought nothing of it at first, but the noise was somehow bringing my attention towards it. I ventured left and onto another path, going slower and trying to find where the noise was coming from. At this point, I'm around 20 minutes in, looking for this strange noise. The skies darkened and I needed to use my flashlight that was attached to my bike. As I turn the light on, the noise stops and I hear nothing. Everywhere around me is dark and there are just trees after trees. The only way out was backwards. So I turn my bike around and start heading back when I hear the call once again, this time much, much louder. I pedal harder and start mumbling to myself. What could this be? Then someone or something touched my arm as I went through a sharp bend. I pedal and pedal, faster and faster, and the noise gets louder and louder. The noise is something I will never forget. And it was like this thing had water gurgling in its mouth and started to screech at the same time. The noise horrified me. As I got to the bottom of the track, I got onto a country road and take my flashlight off my handlebars and scan the woods. What I saw kept me awake for the next few days. It was long, bony and gray in color. Its hands and feet were huge and nothing like a human's. It had long, thick hair in front of those huge white glowing eyes. I turned and pedaled home the fastest I've ever done it. I told my parents and friends the next day, but nobody seemed to believe me. But I know what I saw, and it was terrifying. I know I will never venture into that place ever again, because it is most definitely the home of a skinwalker. I had a strange encounter with one of them on a Navajo reservation as a teenager. I was with a youth group trying to witness Christianity to the Navajos, and there were things that did not want us there. I had stumbled upon what looked like a ritualistic tent, like a teepee covered in animal skins and other crude things earlier in the trip. It gave me the chills for sure. I had heard the whispering about them from the locals during our time on the reservation. One night, chanting outside of the girls' cabin really freaked me out. Someone was circling the cabin and chanting for at least 20 minutes or so. We all remained inside and just prayed. I could not sleep for fear that something or someone was out there. While everyone else slept, I had decided to look outside to be sure no one was there. I finally got the nerve to peer out the window, and there was this white wolf standing in the small beam of light outside about 30 feet away. It was staring right back at me. It was not a normal creature. It looked at me with eyes that did not glow in the darkness, and animals' eyes glow at night, especially near a light source. It looked at me as if it had been waiting for me to peer outside, purposely standing in the one beam of light so I would see it. I later discovered that white wolves are not native to this area, and I never spoke of this to anyone until much later in life. I covered part of the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. My companion and I were given a truck to use since we covered 5 or so small towns of 2,000 people each. We were driving back from Superior, Arizona around sunset. We had a rule that we wouldn't stay in that town past dark due to safety concerns. If anyone is familiar with the Superstition Highway and the turnoff onto 177, this is the area that it happened around. My companion was the one driving, since he had been in that area for the past 5 months. He was much more familiar with it, and he was telling me about the area and the little quirks of the town. Suddenly, this massive and mangy dog walks into the middle of the road, and my companion immediately starts speeding up. I start yelling at him, asking him what he's doing. "You're gonna hit that dog." and he just tells me to shut up and to not look at the thing in the road. As we get closer, it started to look less like a dog and more like a person, but it just sat there in the middle of the road. The truck was going about 100 miles per hour at this point, and as we passed it, I made eye contact with it, and I swear to God it was smiling at me. Its face was just so messed up, like someone had found a dead dog on the road and was wearing its skin. I tried to turn around and look as we passed and immediately get punched in my arm by my companion, and he's screaming that I told you not to look at it. I still try to look back one last time, and this thing takes off running into the desert on all fours. But there was something about the way it moved, almost like it was injured, but it took off at an ungodly speed, and I lost sight of it as we rounded the corner. It took me the whole night to convince my companion to tell me what that was all about. It wasn't until we hear a knock on the door, and this was already past 11 p.m. We were supposed to be back at our apartments at 10, and we hear our district leader's voice coming from the other side. I start walking towards the door, and my companion grabs me from behind, covers my mouth, and tells me that if I open that door, we're both dead. After elbowing him in the gut to get him off of me, he gets on the phone and calls our district manager. He answers, and my companion asks where he is. He responds with, "Dude, it's 11. I'm in bed. Where else would I be?" At this point, I'm convinced they're both messing with me and go to answer the door again since the knocking has continued, and it was starting to annoy me. My companion starts crying and is begging my district leader to swear on his life that he's up in the globe and not outside our apartment. Our district leader broke one of the cardinal rules of cell phone use and sent us a picture of him and his companion in their globe apartment. It had a timestamp and everything. Both missionaries had terrified looks on their faces, and I had no idea why. The knocking had stopped at this point, and I decided to get some sleep. The next day, we had a meeting, and I made an off comment about how stupid it was for them to waste a 2-hour trip just to mess with me since I was new. Everyone got really quiet and started arguing on whether or not they should tell me what had happened. My district leader finally broke down and told me he started on Native American tradition and a brief history of the reservation. It was that day that I learned the legend among the natives of skinwalkers. Back about 10 or so years ago, my good friend and I would occasionally take trips to her family's property out in the middle of nowhere. It was fairly remote. You had to drive up a dirt road a few miles and couldn't access it unless you had a key to the chain on the gate. There wasn't anyone around for miles. All that was there was a trailer they towed up and left there to sleep in. The feelings out there were always a little off. One day, we were wandering around the property, not thinking much about it until 20 minutes later, when we realized we had actually been walking into the middle of nowhere. We had no water with us and really had no clue where we were. Luckily, we found our way back after a while, but neither of us could explain why we did that. It was like we were on autopilot. One day, before heading out there, we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. It was only about a 40 or so minute drive from the property, so we thought to ourselves, hey, why don't we go and try to find it? We thought it would be cool to say we had been there, After searching the internet, we found some fairly good directions and headed out for the night. We did have a bit of trouble locating it, but after a bit of driving around, we pulled into an area that was spot on from the descriptions. We stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was the mass amounts of bugs swarming us. Only a few short seconds later, we had huge dogs barking, growling, and running at us out of what seemed to be nowhere. We immediately jumped back in the car and took off, but we ended up staying in the area for a little longer, exploring from the road. Later that night, back at her property, we were sitting around the fire talking. All of a sudden, we start hearing barking. It was rather startling, and she immediately froze and said she had never heard barking in this area before. She isn't one to get scared easily, so her uneasiness put me on edge. Not too long after, there was more barking. Very slowly, we were being surrounded by what I assume are coyotes. We both tried yelling, jumping around, and throwing rocks, but that didn't seem to do any good. I've never known coyotes to act this way. We were getting terrified and had no clue what to do. Not really wanting to stick around and find out if they'd get any closer to us, we doused the fire and flipped on our flashlights. She grabs my hand and we booked it back to the trailer. We were both shaking by the time we made it in, and she locked the door. I don't think either of us slept that well. I heard a lot of weird sounds and felt a sense of dread the entire night. As soon as the sun started to rise, we decided to pack up and get out of there. We neared the car, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. On the driver's side of the car window was a huge handprint made with mud. It was easily twice the size of our hands. We looked at each other and silently agreed that we needed to get the hell out of there. I truly believe it might have been a skinwalker, but neither one of us have been able to fully explain it. But I've definitely never been back.